Hello! This is a video on personal identity and historical reflection, but it's also an insight on my personal racial identity development throughout taking this course. So I'm going to introduce myself the same way we did on the first day of class. I'm Dulce. I am Latina, a female, and I am heterosexual. And to me, the way we introduced ourselves in class that first day was actually very personal. It seemed like as soon as we started this class, we dove right in and we all realized we had to talk about things we usually wouldn't be comfortable talking about. Gender, race, and identity, although they are the most important topics ever, probably, they're not topics I've had to talk about in a classroom setting ever, and certainly not topics that I've had to get graded on. I remember you teaching us about the color line and me having a complete epiphany. I realized how different I act around my family and other people of my culture as opposed to the way I act when I'm in a white space. Not only was I a victim of this, but a victim of racial capitalism, since there weren't many people like me in my incredibly small school. I grew up in Tahoe, and I was always experienced two very radical cultures there. On one end, there are all very liberal, hippie type millennials, and on the other one, there was like old and rich white men type culture that weren't so open to mine. So it felt like I had to often tiptoe around with my actions since I never knew exactly who I was talking to. And since I grew up in a white space, I remember my parents desperately trying to maintain my Mexican culture. It's actually incredibly difficult straddling two completely different worlds. And I had not realized it until this class when I was forced to examine my identity that I was not exactly sure how I identified. It was actually a difficult thing for me to realize that since I had been living in two completely different worlds, it's almost impossible for me to just identify as Mexican or just identify as an American. And throughout time, especially during this class, and having presentations of like different kinds of people and their identity, and these people being so passionate about who they are, I ended up realizing who I was. I mean, our class learned about identities based on race, like the Black identity, and identities based on religion, like being of Muslim faith, and all that that entails. And we also learned about identities based on nationality and ethnicity, like the Chinese and Native Americans. Identities based on gender and sexual orientation. We had so many, and learning about all of these identities and beliefs that are different than mine made me realize that everyone has a different story, and that in general, people are so different. For example, I mostly liked learning about different identities because the only way to show true respect to these different identities is through educating ourselves in their culture and their history. Otherwise, there is no other way to truly know another person. For example, knowing that my actions merely around with people that practice Muslim faith could be very important, like the way I dress and the way I approach them, or when I am or not allowed to shake their hand. This teaches me not to be disrespectful towards their beliefs. Along with this, it is also the use of pronouns, and since I'm an advocate for human rights, I can now approach people who identify with the LGBTQ community with respect towards their identity. And knowing about the history of these different cultures is also incredibly monumental to knowing how people identify. For example, knowing the struggles of African Americans since the beginning of time makes me realize what a huge setback the entire race was put through since then. No legislation has ever been enough to catch this entire race up to equality with other races. Even monumental government acts like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act are not enough to stop the racism and unequal treatment in this country. As to the LGBTQ plus identity, there are still people who see this community acting on taboo, and it was not until 2015 when the Obergefell v. Hodges case granted same-sex marriage. Thusly, knowing the struggles that certain cultures have gone through allow for me to understand more. And learning about a new identity each week allowed me to also explore my own and dive deep into who I am. The biggest part of finding who I was looking through a historical perspective. Historically, the U.S. has had disastrous reforms on immigration policy. Policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Bracero Program, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, all have been so inefficient by opening their borders and then suddenly closing and locking the door, leaving millions of immigrants without any other option aside from illegal immigration. Most recently, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, also known as DACA, imposed by former President Obama, is another example of giving certain immigrants rights, very minimal rights, and suddenly, under the Trump administration, those basic rights that the executive order granted were just taken away, leaving 800,000 workers and students with nothing. So finally, I realized that I identify myself as a dreamer, along with the 800,000 other people who straddle two different worlds, students and workers who are both their own nationality as well as American.